This is a screencast for Activity 3 of Learning Package 1 of the Building Adaptation and Conservation module, which has been produced as part of the ORBEE project. That's Open Resources in Built Environment Education. This is Tony Burke from the University of Westminster. In Activity 3, what I asked you to do was to consider various scenarios which I presented really to highlight some of the difficult philosophical issues that are often faced when we're dealing with historic buildings. And I've asked you to think about the various principles which I outlined in section 5 and just make a few comments on the issues which arise. So what we're going to do is look at examples which relate to each of the scenarios that were presented. In the first scenario, you were asked to consider a Victorian church in a town centre which is in a very poor state of repair. Because of declining congregations, there's a debate over whether expenditure on repairs can be justified. And so there is a suggestion to incorporate a coffee bar within the church building, which would obviously generate some income for the church, but at the same time the nave could be retained for worship. Now, a lot of people's reaction to such a suggestion would immediately be one of horror, because they wouldn't associate commercial activities with a building which has been designed and built primarily as a place of worship. But there are actually examples, quite a few examples actually, where precisely this sort of thing has been done. This is All Saints Church in Hereford, and the view that you see here looks down towards the altar. It's quite a traditional church, lots of very typical features. But if we take another view, if we walk further down the church and look back up the nave, this is what we'd actually see. So you can see that the chairs which have been laid out in a flexible way, but just through the arch there you can actually see a coffee bar which has been inserted at the rear of the church and is actually quite a successful commercial activity. Here's a couple of other views of it. You can see that it's busy, it's obviously generating a lot of income, but the main part of the church itself has actually been retained for the purposes of worship. Now, the key principle that's actually being illustrated here is that of reversibility, and one of the concepts which I outlined in section 5 was this idea that any changes that are made to an historic building should, wherever possible, be reversible in order to allow the widest range of options for future development or the correction of unforeseen problems. Because we don't actually know what's going to happen to this church in the future. For all we know, congregations could increase again, and there may not be actually a need for the coffee bar. There may be more space needed in the church for worship purposes. So it's important that whenever changes like this are implemented, they are entirely reversible without causing any damage to the historic fabric. So you'll notice that all of the features which relate to the coffee bar are entirely separate from the main structure. There is actually even a toilet pod with an office above that has been inserted within the framework of the fabric, but without actually damaging the fabric itself. So at any point in the future, all of these insertions can relatively easily be removed and the original historic fabric will be retained. So the key concept that's being illustrated here is simply reversibility. We do also have to consider the concepts of the acceptability of adaptations and new uses, and it's generally accepted that any adaptation should be appropriate, so that conservation can continue to be achieved. Okay, the second scenario then, this is an 18th century house. It's going to be refurbished, and currently the roof is covered in handmade clay tiles, but the tiles are cracked, there's water penetration, and there's a recommendation that the roof covering is renewed. However, here's a difficult financial decision that has to be made, and it's one that often arises with historic buildings. If we're going to replace the tiles with the same material that's on there at the moment, i.e. the handmade clay tiles, we're looking at a cost of around £10,000. Alternatively, we could go for a cheaper option with concrete interlocking tiles, and these will only cost around £4,500. So what do we do? Well, here's a typical 18th century house, plain clay tiles on the roof. A difficult decision faces us. What we could do, if we look at the existing state of the roof, we can see clearly that there is a need to renew the roof coverings. There's lots of cracked and broken tiles there. So, as I say, what we could do is simply replace it with modern concrete interlocking tiles, and these would certainly be much cheaper. But is it appropriate? We have to consider the um, uh, the, the concept of honesty. We need to make sure that repairs that are carried out don't make any attempt at disguise or artificially aging the materials, but we need to really make sure that any replacement materials are sympathetic. So the key concept here is the use of appropriate techniques and materials, and wherever possible, wherever we're working on a historic building, the materials that we use for repairs should match the original. And I would suggest that in this instance, concrete interlocking tiles would look inappropriate on a building of the importance that we're dealing with. So really what we should be looking at doing is replacing the original roof covering with like for like. In other words, putting back new plain clay tiles. They might look rather stark and fresh when they're first installed, but over a period of time they will weather in and they will take on that natural character which only really natural materials can achieve. The third scenario then is about repointing to stonework on a church. Again, this is a very common problem that arises over a period of time. Stonework, which was traditionally pointed with a lime mortar, the lime mortar does erode, it does become loose, and it does allow water penetration, and that can obviously lead to additional problems. So it's often the case that very well-meaning but misguided people can recommend repointing with sand and cement mortar. So here's a typical situation. We've got an old church constructed in stone, as I say, lime mortar pointing to the church, and this is the sort of thing that's often carried out by misguided people. A very stiff sand and cement mortar used to repoint the walls. However, this approach is entirely inappropriate. First of all, it doesn't look right. It upsets the aesthetics of the church, these very hard sort of ribbons of sand and cement mortar. But more importantly, sand and cement mortar is very hard and dense. What happens with stonework walls is that the water will soak into porous stonework, and it will normally evaporate through the path of least resistance, which typically means that evaporation will take place through the joints. And with a lime mortar, where you've got a relatively soft material, that's fine. The water will just naturally evaporate through the joints. However, when you repoint with sand and cement mortar, effectively the mortar becomes trapped in the stone itself. The water will then freeze in cold water, it will expand when it freezes, and it will basically blow the face of the stone off. And we end up with situations like this, where the mortar joints are left solid, but the stonework is badly damaged by the use of inappropriate materials. So the key principle that we're looking at here again is the use of appropriate techniques and materials. We really ought to be repointing with a lime mortar to make sure that that evaporation can still occur. The next scenario and that's the just a picture to show some good quality lime mortar pointing. The next scenario is on the same church, and what we've got is stone gargoyles at the top of a tower, but these are badly weathered. If you're not sure what we mean by this term gargoyles, if you look upwards on many churches and cathedrals, you will often see these projecting figures from the base of a tower, or usually at very high level. Looking more closely at them, they are usually grotesque figures, and they were installed originally as a decorative feature, but they were designed to effectively ward off evil spirits. They're a common feature on many old churches and cathedrals, but clearly they're now centuries old, and many of them are in very poor condition, and often they can actually become dangerous, because if the stone erodes badly enough, then clearly there is a danger that the gargoyles themselves could drop off. Now, what's being proposed here is the replacement of these figures with new figures produced with modern materials. So you can produce these sorts of things in resin-based materials, or glass fiber reinforced polymers, and it would be possible to achieve a very effective reproduction with similar colors and textures, but obviously it is not a like-for-like replacement material. So again, a concept that we have to consider here is the question of honesty in repairs. We shouldn't be trying to deceive people looking up at the gargoyles, but inevitably the question of expense comes into play, because clearly it's going to be a lot cheaper to replace these gargoyles with plastic-based materials, but if you're sticking to conservation principles, it would really be far better to either repair the existing gargoyles or create new gargoyles again in stone. So it's a question of honesty, really. And the final scenario is an interesting one, because it's a real case that actually happened. An observatory tower that was built in 1831. It stands on a cliff, but it's so close to the cliff that coastal erosion has meant that there's a danger that it's actually going to just collapse into the sea. So this is Clavell Tower in Dorset, and this was its original location. It was very close to the cliff edge, and as I say, it was in danger of simply falling into the sea. It's obviously in a very poor state of repair, but it was considered to be an important historic building, and so a decision was taken to dismantle the tower stone by stone and actually re-erect it in a new location a few meters further inland, where it was in far less danger of the effects of coastal erosion. And what you can see here is this circular outline in the foreground represents the original location of the tower, and then you can see its new location, where it was literally rebuilt, actually making sure that every stone was in an identical position to that of the original building. So in many cases, restoration of historic buildings is frowned on by conservation purists, but in this case there was no conjecture involved. It was a genuine restoration, because they had the evidence, the physical evidence of what the building was like in its original location, and so they were able to recreate that just a few yards away and thus preserve an important historic building. And there it is in all its glory, in its reconstructed form, and so an important historic building has been preserved. And I think that was a worthwhile exercise. So hopefully that's introduced you to some of the interesting situations that can arise when you're having to carry out works to historic buildings. Thank you.